In the shadows of American history lie stories that powerful men tried to bury, stories of courage that challenged the cruel order of things. She's barely 17. Her father owes him money. What choice does she have? That's just how things are done here. But on one fateful day in 1878, in a dusty Texas town, an unlikely hero would stand against tradition, against power, against everything they thought was law. What happened next would change the course of countless lives forever. Before we dive into this untold story from America's frontier, I need to ask you something important. Are you tired of history books that leave out the real heroes? The black men and women who shaped the West despite overwhelming odds? If you are, hit that subscribe button and ring that bell. This channel, The Black Rancher, is dedicated to bringing these powerful stories to light. This video may challenge what you think you know about American history, so stay with me until the very end. I promise the final moments of this story will leave you speechless. Now let's begin. West Texas, June 1878. The summer heat shimmered above the parched earth as Elijah Montgomery rode into the small town of Redemption, Texas. At 35, he sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders and powerful frame casting an imposing silhouette against the blazing afternoon sun. Years of working his land had hardened his muscles and darkened his already ebony skin, while sharp, observant eyes missed little beneath the brim of his weather-worn hat. The Lone Star Ranch, as Elijah had named it, had grown from a humble 100 acres into a thriving cattle operation spanning nearly 800 acres of prime Texas grassland. 15 years of backbreaking work, smart investments, and an uncanny ability to predict rainfall patterns had turned the former slave into one of the most successful ranchers in the county, a fact that many white residents of Redemption found difficult to stomach. Elijah tied his chestnut stallion outside Hartwell's general store. He needed supplies, coffee, flour, ammunition, and news. In these parts, information was as valuable as gold, and Hartwell served as the town's unofficial gathering place. As he stepped inside, conversations died. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward him, some curious, others hostile. "Afternoon," Elijah said with a polite nod, his deep voice carrying across the suddenly quiet store. Old Man Hartwell nodded back curtly. The storekeeper was one of the few who'd treat him fairly, if not warmly. "Mr. Montgomery, what can I do for you today?" Before Elijah could answer, the door to the back room swung open. A young woman emerged, no more than 17, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Her simple calico dress couldn't hide her trembling shoulders as she clutched a handkerchief in white-knuckled hands. Behind her came 2 men. The first was Jacob Miller, owner of the failing Miller farm that bordered Elijah's ranch to the east. His face was haggard, shame and desperation etched into every line. The second man was Horace Wilkes, the town's wealthiest resident and owner of the bank that held loans on half the properties in the county. At 62, Wilkes had buried 3 wives already, each one younger than the last. "It's settled then," Wilkes was saying, his thin lips stretched into what might generously be called a smile. "The wedding will be Sunday next. I'll have the papers drawn up tomorrow." The girl, Elijah now recognized her as Sarah Miller, Jacob's only daughter, looked down at the floor, a single tear tracking down her pale cheek. "Mr. Miller," Wilkes continued, "your debt will be considered paid in full once the ceremony is complete. A fair trade, I'd say." His eyes traveled over Sarah in a way that made Elijah's jaw tighten. Jacob Miller nodded weakly. "Yes, Mr. Wilkes, we're grateful for your understanding." "Papa, please," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not another word," Jacob hissed. "We've discussed this, it's done." Elijah stood motionless, watching the scene unfold. He'd heard rumors about Wilkes looking for a new bride, but this was something else entirely. The girl was being sold to settle a debt, plain and simple, though they'd never call it that. As the men shook hands, Sarah glanced up, her eyes briefly meeting Elijah's across the store. In that moment, he saw something beyond her tears, a fierce will to live, to be free. It was a look he recognized from his own reflection during darker times. The moment passed quickly, as Jacob took his daughter's arm and led her toward the door. They would have to pass directly by Elijah to leave. As they drew near, Elijah stepped slightly aside, tipping his hat respectfully. "Miss Miller," he said quietly. Jacob tensed, pulling his daughter closer, as if Elijah's mere proximity might contaminate her. Sarah, however, paused almost imperceptibly, her eyes meeting his again with an unspoken plea. And in that moment, Elijah Montgomery knew he could not simply stand by and watch. 3 days passed as Elijah deliberated what, if anything, he could do. The situation wasn't unusual in these parts. Desperate families with mounting debts often sacrificed daughters to satisfy creditors, all under the guise of respectable marriage. But something about Sarah Miller's eyes haunted him. On the 4th morning, Elijah rode to the Miller farm. The once prosperous homestead had fallen into disrepair. Fences sagged, fields lay fallow, and the barn roof had collapsed on one side. The drought had been particularly cruel to smaller operations like Miller's. Jacob Miller was attempting to fix a broken wagon wheel when Elijah approached. Seeing the black rancher ride up, Miller straightened, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle leaning against the wagon. "Morning, Mr. Miller," Elijah called, stopping at a respectful distance. "Montgomery," Miller replied stiffly. "What brings you to my property?" Elijah dismounted slowly. "I have a business proposition. Thought you might want to hear it before making any permanent arrangements with Mr. Wilkes." Miller's eyes narrowed. "I don't see what business of yours—" "How much do you owe him?" Elijah interrupted. The question hung in the air between them. Miller's jaw worked as he struggled with his pride. $500, he finally admitted, the sum clearly paining him to speak aloud. Elijah nodded. It was a substantial amount, the equivalent of several years' hard work for a small farmer. "I'll pay it." Miller's eyebrows shot up. "You'll what?" "I'll pay your debt to Wilkes, all of it." Elijah kept his voice matter-of-fact. "In return, I want to buy your north pasture, the 40 acres that border my land." The offer made sense. Elijah had been looking to expand, and Miller's land adjoined his own. Still, Jacob Miller looked suspicious. "Why would you do this? That pasture ain't worth 500. "It is to me," Elijah replied simply. "Water rights alone make it valuable, and it's better than the alternative, isn't it?" Miller's face darkened. "If you're implying—" "I'm not implying anything, Mr. Miller. I'm making a business offer. You sell me that land, I'll pay off Wilkes, and your daughter stays home where she belongs. Seems straightforward enough." Inside the farmhouse, a curtain moved. Sarah stood at the window watching the two men, her future hanging in the balance of their conversation. Miller looked from Elijah to the house and back again. Even if I agreed, Wilkes wouldn't accept it. He's set on having Sarah. It's not just about the money for him. "Let me handle Wilkes," Elijah said. "Do we have a deal?" Miller hesitated, pride warring with practicality. Finally, he extended his hand. "We have a deal, Montgomery, though I don't know how you plan to convince Wilkes." As they shook hands, Sarah appeared at the door of the farmhouse, hope cautiously dawning on her face for the first time in weeks. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, take a moment right now to hit that like button. It helps more people discover these untold stories on the Black Rancher channel. I'm uncovering the hidden history of America's frontier, the stories that deserve to be told but have been erased for far too long. Subscribe now if you haven't already, and let's continue this journey together. Now let's return to our story and see how Elijah plans to confront one of the most powerful men in redemption. The next morning, Elijah rode into town dressed in his finest clothes, a tailored black suit he rarely wore, complete with a silver watch chain his former master had been forced to give him as part of his emancipation settlement. Appearances mattered when dealing with men like Horace Wilkes. Redemption's Bank occupied the most impressive building in town, a 2-story brick structure with real glass windows and ornate columns flanking the entrance. As Elijah tied his horse to the hitching post out front, he could feel eyes watching from every storefront. The bank teller, a nervous young man with spectacles, nearly dropped his ledger when Elijah walked in. "I'd like to see Mr. Wilkes," Elijah stated, his voice calm but firm. He doesn't see people without appointments, the teller stammered. Tell him Elijah Montgomery is here about the Miller property. He'll see me. 5 minutes later, Elijah was shown into Wilkes's private office. The banker sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a cigar clenched between his yellowing teeth. Montgomery? Wilkes acknowledged without standing. Didn't know you had business at my bank. I do now, Elijah replied, remaining on his feet. I'm here about Jacob Miller's debt. Wilkes's eyebrows rose slightly. Miller's affairs are between him and me. I fail to see your interest in the matter. I've purchased Miller's north pasture, Elijah said, placing the hastily drawn bill of sale on the desk, and I'm prepared to settle his debt in full. From his jacket, Elijah produced a canvas bag that landed on the desk with a heavy clink. $500. Count it if you like. Wilkes stared at the bag, then at Elijah, his face reddening. This is highly irregular. Miller and I have already come to an arrangement. A new arrangement has been made, Elijah countered. His debt will be paid in currency, not with his daughter. The banker's eyes narrowed dangerously. You're overstepping, Montgomery. Way I hear it, you've been doing a lot of that lately, getting ideas above your station. My station is as a free man and a property owner, same as you, Elijah replied evenly, and my money spends the same as any white man's. Wilkes stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the wooden floor. This isn't about money. That girl was promised to me. She's a person, not property to be promised, Elijah said, his voice hardening. Those days are supposed to be over. The banker laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. You think because you've got some land and cattle the rules have changed. They haven't, not for your kind. He pushed the money bag back toward Elijah. I don't want your money. I want what Miller promised me. Elijah didn't touch the bag. Then I'll be forced to take this matter to the federal marshal in El Paso. I understand they take a dim view of certain arrangements these days, especially when they involve coercion and young girls. It was a bold threat, perhaps even a dangerous one, but Elijah knew that Wilkes, for all his local power, feared outside scrutiny. The banker had too many questionable dealings that wouldn't withstand a marshal's investigation. Wilkes glared at Elijah, hatred burning in his eyes. You're making a serious mistake, Montgomery. This town isn't big enough for the both of us. Then perhaps one of us should consider moving on, Elijah replied calmly. Now, do we have a deal, or shall I send a telegram to El Paso this afternoon? For several tense moments, the only sound in the office was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, Wilkes reached for the money bag. Get out of my bank, he snarled, and watch your back. Things happen to troublemakers in these parts. Elijah nodded once, turned and walked out, his back straight, knowing full well that he had just made a powerful enemy. Word spread quickly through redemption. By nightfall, everyone knew that Elijah Montgomery had faced down Horace Wilkes and walked away victorious. Some admired his courage. Others saw it as further proof that he needed to be put in his place. As Elijah finished his evening chores, he spotted a rider approaching his ranch house. The fading light revealed it to be Jacob Miller, looking uncomfortable atop his old mare. Evening, Miller, Elijah called, setting down the bucket he was carrying. Miller dismounted awkwardly. Montgomery. He cleared his throat. I came to thank you. Sarah. Well, she's mighty relieved. Elijah nodded. Glad to hear it. Wilkes isn't a man who forgets, Miller warned. He'll come after you now. I expect he will. Miller shuffled his feet, clearly wrestling with something. Look, I didn't think I'd ever be beholden to a... He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. To a black man? Elijah supplied. Miller nodded reluctantly. You're not beholden to me, Elijah said. We made a fair business deal. The land was worth the price. We both know that's not entirely true, Miller said, showing unexpected insight. You could have had that land for half what you paid. Elijah shrugged. Maybe. Maybe not. After an awkward silence, Miller spoke again. Wilkes has called a meeting tomorrow night at the saloon. Town council and other property owners. I heard from Fletcher at the feed store that they're planning something. Against you. This wasn't surprising, but having confirmation was valuable. I appreciate the warning, Elijah said. Miller hesitated. I'll be there, at the meeting. Seeing Elijah's expression, he added quickly, not to join them, to speak against whatever they're planning. Elijah studied the man before him. Jacob Miller had never been openly hostile like some, but neither had he been friendly. This change of heart seemed genuine, if uncomfortable for him. That could make you unpopular, Elijah observed. Miller managed a weak smile. Already am. Been unpopular since my crops failed 3 years running. He straightened his shoulders. Besides, my Sarah said she'd never speak to me again if I didn't stand up for the man who saved her from Wilkes. Elijah nodded, a new respect forming for both Miller and his daughter. Wilkes won't act alone, he said. He'll try to get the town behind him, make it seem like community action instead of personal vendetta. You need allies, Miller said. I can't offer much, but there are others who've had run-ins with Wilkes. Peterson lost his livery to a loan that suddenly came due. Widow Jensen nearly lost her boarding house the same way. He paused. They might be persuaded to stand with us. Us? Elijah raised an eyebrow. Miller looked uncomfortable again, but nodded firmly. Us. As the sun set over the Texas plains, an unlikely alliance was forming, one that would soon be tested in ways neither man could fully anticipate. The Broken Spoke Saloon was packed the following evening. Nearly every man in Redemption had turned out for what was being called an emergency town meeting. Elijah, of course, had not been invited, but that didn't mean he was unaware of the proceedings. Inside, Horace Wilkes stood before the gathered townspeople, his face flushed with self-righteous anger. Gentlemen, he began, we face a threat to our way of life. When a man of Montgomery's background can challenge the natural order with impunity, where does it end? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. I propose we form a committee to address this problem, Wilkes continued. Property values are at stake. The safety of our women and children is at stake. In the corner, Jacob Miller stood up. What exactly are you suggesting, Wilkes? He asked loudly. Because it sounds like you're just sore about a business deal that didn't go your way. Heads turned in surprise. Miller had never spoken out at town meetings before. Wilkes glared at him. This isn't about business, Miller, you know that. Isn't it? Another voice joined in, Tom Peterson, the former livery owner. Seems to me Montgomery's only crime was having enough money to stop you from forcing a teenage girl into your bed. Shocked gasps and uncomfortable shifting followed this blunt assessment. Wilkes's face darkened. How dare you? Miller offered his daughter's hand in marriage to settle a debt. A perfectly legal arrangement. Legal, maybe, called Martha Jensen from the back of the room. The widow rarely attended town meetings, but she stood firm now. Moral? That's another question entirely. Wilkes looked around, realizing he might not have the unanimous support he'd expected. Since when do you people defend a successful rancher? Miller interrupted. A man who pays his debts. A neighbor who helps others in need. Is that what you were going to say? The saloon had grown unusually quiet, the men inside becoming aware of movement outside. Through the windows they could see riders approaching, at least 20 men on horseback, moving slowly down the main street toward the saloon. What the hell? Someone muttered. Wilkes smiled coldly. Ah, right on time. I took the liberty of contacting some associates from neighboring counties. Men who understand what needs to be done. The implications were clear, and a chill fell over the room. Vigilante justice was not uncommon in these parts, especially when directed at those who challenged the established order. Marshal Davis, Redemption's aging lawman, stood up with a worried expression. Wilkes, I can't allow any vigilante action in my town. Then I suggest you take the night off, Marshal, Wilkes replied. These men aren't interested in your badge. Outside, the riders had stopped in front of the saloon. But as the townspeople watched, a second group of riders appeared at the far end of the street, another 20 men, led by a familiar figure on a chestnut stallion. Elijah Montgomery had not come alone. The doors to the saloon swung open and Elijah stepped inside. Behind him stood ranch hands from across the county, black, Mexican, and white men who worked the land together despite the prejudices of the town. Evening, gentlemen, Elijah said calmly. Heard there was a meeting about me, thought I should attend. Wilkes's face contorted with rage. This is a private gathering, Montgomery. Nothing private about planning violence against a fellow citizen, Elijah replied. He looked around the room. I know many of you don't like me, don't approve of what I am or what I've built. That's your right. But ask yourselves this. If Wilkes can organize a mob against me today for defying him, who will he target tomorrow when one of you stands in his way? A murmur ran through the crowd as this sank in. He's got a point, someone said. Wilkes did try to force foreclosure on my brother last spring, another added. Wilkes slammed his hand on the table. Enough! This isn't about me. Montgomery is the problem here. No, Jacob Miller said, stepping forward. The problem is that for too long we've let men like you decide what's right and wrong in this town. My daughter isn't property to be traded. Montgomery's land isn't up for grabs just because you want it, and this town isn't yours to rule through fear. Outside, the two groups of riders watched each other warily across the distance of Redemption's main street, neither making a move. Inside, Marshal Davis had moved to stand near Elijah. Not exactly beside him, but not opposed either. There'll be no violence in my town tonight, he announced. Any man who wants to start something will answer to the law. Wilkes looked around the saloon, seeing his support eroding. Even men who harbored no love for Elijah were eyeing Wilkes with new suspicion. This isn't over, the banker snarled, pushing his way toward the door. Actually it is, Elijah replied. From his pocket, he produced a folded telegram. This arrived from Austin this morning. The State Banking Commission is sending representatives to examine your books, Mr. Wilkes. Seems there have been concerns raised about your lending practices. The color drained from Wilkes's face. You can't... I didn't, Elijah said. But it seems your reputation has spread beyond our little town. He glanced at Widow Jensen, who smiled tightly. She had family connections in the state capital, connections she had apparently put to good use. As the implications of this news rippled through the room, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Men who moments before had been ready to join a mob against Elijah now backed away from Wilkes, as if he carried a disease. I suggest you call off your friends outside, Elijah said quietly, before this situation becomes something none of us can control. Wilkes glared at him with naked hatred, but even he could see that the tide had turned. Without another word, he stormed out of the saloon. Minutes later, his hired riders departed, leaving Redemption's main street to Elijah and his allies. Inside the saloon, an unusual quiet had fallen. Then Jacob Miller raised his glass. To Redemption, he said. Maybe now it can start living up to its name. Slowly other glasses were raised. Not every man participated, but enough did to signal the beginning of something new in the small Texas town. As the evening progressed, Elijah found himself in conversation with townspeople who had previously avoided him. Not all the barriers fell that night, but cracks appeared in walls that had seemed impenetrable. A week later, Horace Wilkes left town ahead of the Banking Commission investigators. He would never return to Redemption. And on a warm Sunday afternoon that fall, Elijah Montgomery stood beside Jacob Miller as Sarah Miller married young Thomas Fletcher, the son of the feed store owner, a union based on love rather than obligation. When Elijah caught Sarah's eye during the ceremony, she mouthed two words to him, "Thank you." It was, he thought, redemption indeed. Stories like this one are the missing pieces of American history, the untold courage of people who challenged injustice when it would have been easier to look away. If this story moved you, please hit that subscribe button and share this video. Every share helps these forgotten heroes reclaim their rightful place in the story of how the West was truly won, not just by guns and gold, but by moral courage and unexpected alliances. On the Black Rancher channel, we're committed to bringing you these powerful stories that history books overlooked. Join us next week for another chapter in the real American frontier. Thank you for watching, and remember, courage knows no color.